Let's continue our study of urbanization by taking a look at let's just say video model 4, taking a look at the models of North American cities. So I'm just going to start off with a reminder that we're going to keep the same essential question that we worked with in class, which is how are cities internally structured? No need to rewrite this if you have since mastered this, but just something to remind us about, because this concept of bid rent theory sort of sits at the heart of several of these different models of North American cities. So again, bid rent theory says that the price paid to rent or purchase land is based upon how useful it is, which is the idea that in the central place, there's going to be far more services, far more amenities. Amenities are things like benefits, basically. So there's going to be far more amenities like movie theaters, different types of restaurants, just different types of entertainment that'll all be located closer in the central place, which in turn then means that the price to rent and purchase land there is going to be significantly more expensive than it is farther out into in the surrounding regions in the hinterland. So as that graph there is kind of cool because it says as you can see, high volume retailing is going to be particularly useful and found directly there in the center city, and then it continues to expand from there, which speaks a lot to the idea again of urban sprawl, that the residential areas are going to continue to expand as land is more affordable, and in particular as rent and mortgages get more and more expensive in the city center. So we got three key basic models, and then we got two sort of expanded models, more newer models of the internal structure of North American cities. So you got the concentric zone model, and also known as the Burgess model, the Hoyt sector model, and the Harrison-Ullman multiple nuclei model. I'm calling all of them by both the name of their creator and the model name itself, because the AP exam could do both. Something to note is all three of these basic models were developed based on Chicago, which is indicative of the fact that the basis of how a city is internally structured changes over time. We started with concentric zone, and as different factors came into play, the city evolved, and new components, new factors determined how a city developed. So let's start with the basic one of the concentric zone model, which is the Burgess model. This emerged in 1925. And it was based around the idea of a single CBD, a single central business district. Here we found financial centers, retail, theater, museums, again, exactly what I just named as amenities. Important to note again that there's a single central business district here. Concentric zone model bases the development of a city around social class. So this model determines that different social classes live in different places. So we see in zone 2, the zone of transition, that would be the it's a transition into residential area. So nobody really lives in the CBD. Rent is too high, according to the concentric zone model. To some extent, you can think of this as no one really living in downtown in the Farragut Square and the McPherson Square area. That's all businesses. It's all extremely high rent district, and it's all owned by offices. Zone 2 is where we see this transition to residential with deterioration. So some light industry. We see that the quality of the infrastructure is not quite as high as it is in the central business district. We see in Zone 3, that would be, according to this model, that's called the blue-collar labor housing, also known as sort of the area of working man quarters. Here's where we would see ethnic enclaves from the people who could afford to move out of Zone 2. We see, again, just generally residential area for blue-collar workers. You'll notice the increase in social class here. So we're going from blue collar, now we're moving into zone 4, which is the middle class residential area. Slightly more room, better middle class housing. We're starting to see some single family homes. And finally, in zone 5, we see the suburban ring, where we've got high income housing. That's typically the end of the trolley line or end of the light rail here in DC. That's going to be the end of the MARC train and the VRE. And essentially what Burgess model says is that that's the highest rent area because the people can afford to commute. That MARC trains costing or actually I don't know about MARC, but VRE costs $16 a day to commute. That's an enormous expense. And this argues here that the people live in the suburbs because they can simply afford that commute. The validity of this model is certainly up for question, and that's what we're really going to examine. Keeping in mind this came into play in 1925, where we still had factories primarily located within the city region. Second model is the Homer-Hoyt model, or the sector model. Sorry, let's get this date in proper order. What this Hoyt sector model shows us is that cities develop along transportation lines. So whereas in the Burgess model we had a clear differentiation around social class, the Homer-Hoyt sector model shows us that the cities develop along transportation line. That's what drives the development. What that leaves us with, in industrial zones, I'm sorry, in the placement of industry within the city itself. And you can catch me there because clearly that's less relevant to our modern day cities, as most factories, or very few factories at all, are located within the city center itself. So this was based on 142 cities, but in reality it was ultimately driven by the development of Chicago. You see here we have the pie-shaped wedges, this idea of the transportation lines that were created by Hoyt. I'm going to go back for a minute to a different diagram, this one here. You can see as they're labeled, we've got different, the transportation lines themselves directly next to them. Typically we have industry, we also have high rent. You can consider this that it's more expensive to live next to the metro because of the convenience than it is to live far from a metro. People were willing to pay money to get access to that transportation line. A little bit next to that, we're going to have middle income, and then farthest away from the transportation line, you would have low income because it's more isolated. It's not as valuable to people. As it says, this is a little bit repetitive on that third bullet point, but the transportation and industrial zones are what account for these different sectors. So as opposed to those concentric rings that were sort of an easy way to structure a society, we have a little bit more complicated structure that's really, really driven by where the transportation lines are. Also a certain amount of validity that still remains to this day. How perfectly this fits a city in modern day, that's again what we're going to analyze. Lastly, we have the Chauncey Harris and Edward Ullman multiple nuclei model, which came out in 1945. Here we start to see the idea that the CBD is no longer the sole force that creates these land use patterns. No longer is it a single CBD that's driving all of the transportation, all of the commercial, retail, everything else. So you can see again for the concentric zone and for the Hoyt sector model, we really have a lot of these different transportation, a lot of these different development patterns based around that single CBD. We see for this one, we've got in the multiple nuclei model, we actually have the development of competing and subsidiary, meaning lesser, competing CBDs that are starting to emerge. So you'll notice that there's development. Actually, I'm going to back myself up to give a simplistic definition here. In the multiple nuclei model, development is independent of the CBD. It's independent. So look at the model up at the top right-hand side here, so I can point to this. If you see here, we have high rent residential districts and middle rent residential districts that are emerging independent of the CBD. There isn't necessarily a direct connection here. Again, this is 1945, so we still have our heavy industry primarily located within the central business or within the city center. On the whole, though, simply saying that the multiple nuclei, just like the nucleus is the center of the cell, the nuclei is the reference to the idea that there are multiple center points within a city, multiple nodes within a city. I'm going to draw a comparison to modern day, but I don't want to go too in depth with this comparison because I want to use it again for a different model. But consider this like the idea that there's a downtown Bethesda, there's a Rockville, there's a Silver Spring, there's a Tyson's Corner, there's Arlington downtown. All of these different nodes that are outside of the city, or better yet, even within the city. You can give the examples of there being the downtown region, Georgetown, H Street, Minnesota Avenue, soon up and coming Potomac Avenue is starting to emerge as well. So these are all different independent nodes or hearths or nuclei within the city model itself that are independent of that downtown business district we already talked about. What this also really, in essence, is showing us is the acceleration of suburbanization. So the growth of the suburbs, the less densely populated, more middle-class housing. And when people have that middle-class housing in these larger plots of land, that in turn drives the need for central places outside of the central business district. This is all coming back to central place theory again here, that the idea that if we have a lot of people living out in the suburbs here, then those people in turn are going to start to have their own central places that provide services for them as well. So this model really emerged. You notice the timing here in 1945, as soldiers came home from World War II, they began to want their favorable loans. The GI Bill provided education and in turn economic opportunity. So we saw that the soldiers began to want to settle down, and we see that coupled with favorable loans and for cars and mortgages led to the massive explosion of the suburbs following World War II. Here are two other models that I want to discuss. I'm going to flip up these slides. One of them is called the urban realm model. So you see we have a much more updated, though hardly present, current, but still significantly more up to date than the 1925 concentric zone model. This one called the urban realm model. I'm going to read it and then I'm going to explain it. Each realm is a separate economic, social, and political entity, just a thing, that is linked together to form a larger metro framework. Now consider this. First let's talk about this idea that the urban realm there is still a general central city and that still has a central business district. Let's attempt to apply this to Washington, D.C. We still have Washington, D.C. itself, but notice how we have the development of these larger regions outside of D.C. who in their own right have a suburban downtown. Now this is almost confusing because I basically just gave this example here with the multiple nuclei model. Let's differentiate it. Multiple nuclei model would say within the city itself there are multiple nodes. The evolution of that, the chronology here is important, the idea that one came before the other. The chronology here is that we now have massive suburbanization, widespread urban sprawl, the spreading out of the city, and now we have suburbs that are basically, that in many ways are central places in and of themselves that do not necessarily depend upon the central business district as they once did in, say, 1925 here with the concentric zone model. So these urban realms are the idea that we have, I'm just bouncing all over the place, that we have the CBD in the central city, and then we have all kinds of downtown or suburban networks. You'll notice too that the airport often functions as one of these suburban realms. What these are often referred to is the development of edge cities. Edge cities are a large node of office and retail activities on the edge of an urban area. If you have ever gone to Tyson's Corner, now known as Tyson's, and you have experienced the definition of an edge city. About 15, 20 years ago, Tyson's was primarily comprised of the mall. Now we have Tyson's Corner. If you consider this to be Washington, D.C., we've got Dulles Airport out here. We've got Tyson's Corner about halfway in between. The entire realm outside from Washington, D.C., all the way out to Reston, there's a whole other world out there. There's an enormous amount of defense contractors, meaning people who are hired by the government for defense purposes. There's just an enormous amount of economic activity out there. There are new apartment buildings that are developed. They have their own Reston downtown. Tyson's itself have been just exploded in this development. That is the definition of an edge city, because the people that live in Tyson's are in many ways independent of Washington, D.C. There may be a lot of traffic, maybe coming downtown to go out or go to bars or go to shopping centers. But for the most part, we have an entire city with its own downtown outside of Washington, D.C. This started to emerge by 1970s. As it says here, the outer cities are becoming increasingly independent with their own CBDs that duplicated the functions of the central city. That's important because notice in the example I just gave, they may come down to Georgetown. There are some different shops, but they got Tyson's Corner Mall. You got that crazy expensive Tyson's 2 right there that you can go to. May come down for restaurants. A lot of the restaurants that are being developed out in Tyson's are duplications of restaurants that are the new up-and-coming hit restaurants, like Matchbox Pizza in D.C. Now has locations out in Tyson's as well. So these are totally independent of one another. Regional shopping centers, businesses, and industrial parks developed in the suburban areas due to cheaper land prices and the availability of customers and workers. This, again, is central place theory. If we've got all of these people who are now occupying the suburbs, that in turn is going to drive the development of a central place, leading to an edge city. These are the qualifications. There's absolutely no reason to write this down, but this is just the kind of the general qualifications of what an edge city would be. I took a picture of, this is a screenshot of an urban planning model that one of the contractors has currently for an area of Tyson's. And you can see, I mean, you got the walking center, you got green space, you got the cars. I mean, this is just a key example of the development of an edge city. That sign on the bottom there for 46A office, I think that's off of 66. That's outdated because now Tyson's Corner is just Tyson's because it's no longer just a little, I guess, a little corner area. It's an enormous sprawling region. You can see it's got to have at least 5 million square feet of office space. It's got to have 600,000 amount of retail space. Then make sure it's part of recreation and commerce as well as work. It's got to have more jobs than bedrooms, meaning that it's another central place. Must be perceived as the population as one place. So the people, it's got to have that vernacular region idea that this is an edge city and this is in one place, not just a bunch of random office buildings together. And this one's the big one that really hits Tyson's. It must have been nothing like a city 30 years earlier. Tyson's was nothing like a city. In fact, I got to invest some time in looking up pictures of Tyson's 30 years ago because it most definitely was not an edge city. This is another, this example also applies well to LA because LA's got its beltway there, the Central Road, and then all kinds of urban realms around it that are just, you got Beverly Hills, and I'm going to speak completely, I'm very ignorantly here, but you got San Fernando, you got, what else do I see on this map? Long Beach, things I've seen on TV but never actually experienced myself. These urban realms that have their own central business districts in and of themselves. To further confuse you about another potential applicable model is a model called the galactic model or the peripheral model. I really struggle to say that. Galactic model of North American urban cities. This model dictates that there's an inner city surrounded by a large suburban and residential business areas that are tied together by a beltway or a ring road. Well, if you have ever had the miserable experience of sitting around the beltway, which is this perfect ring road that encompasses the central city area, then you know that DC has in fact one of these beltways. Similar concept you can see in the model at the top there, that in the galactic model and the peripheral model. This too, like the urban realms model, is driven by the idea that you have a lot of development that's outside of the central business district. If you consider, again, the key idea here is that from the CBD of the concentric zone model, the Burgess model, all the way through to this peripheral galactic model, and the urban realms model, what we see is just the enormous expansion of services and central places outside of the CBD and outside of what is formally defined as the center city. So just enormous suburbanization that really characterizes the development of North America, and none of which would be possible if not for the car. These models help us see why it is the U.S. is so incredibly dependent upon oil, because we have just a tremendous dependency upon cars for all of the development of all of our cities. I forgot why I put this in here. Oh, because you can see that these earlier development of manufacturing cities, you can see that over time we've got the much greater sprawl of services. Retail centers and our cities themselves are more diversified as the car became more and more widely available. Okie dokie. That is it. Here are your analysis questions, and we will take it into international models of cities from here.